So, thank you all for coming. My name is Kevin Metcalf. I'm a system administrator at De Anza College, and once or twice a year they let me teach a class. One of the classes they let me teach is the Perl class, and therefore students submit all sorts of interesting examples of Perl code, which I then injure myself attempting to read. Originally, this was scheduled to be a 20-minute talk. I found out this morning it was going to be a 45-minute talk. Not a problem. I have a perfect strategy for dealing with this. So thank you all for... No, I'm kidding. All of these examples are, in fact, real examples. I have changed every name in here for reasons that should be obvious. Number one, I don't want to crush someone's ego should one of my former students happen to watch the video stream. And number two, I would like to avoid any precarious legal entanglements. So let's start out by just taking a second to define the difference between a student and a professional. And this is a really easy one to define, right? Because the only real difference between a student programmer and a professional programmer is experience, or what the cynics out there would call, cynicism. But I prefer to call it experience, because experience is that thing that you get immediately after you so desperately needed it, right? I mean, that's what experience is. And so I have to confess, I do have a wee bit of an evil side plan here, and a separate agenda, which is where I work, I do not have any coworkers who know any Perl at all. And therefore, when I get these amazing examples of code that come to me and I go, oh, I have no one to show this to. So you get to be the people that I could show this to. So hopefully you will enjoy these little snippets of code as much as I've enjoyed watching them. And the motivation for this talk is explicitly to give everyone an opportunity to laugh, because it's sort of the end of the conference, and cramming your heads full of more information would probably be futile anyway. So if you can't decide whether you want to yell at me for showing an example or laugh, I recommend laughing. I know, I'm going out on a limb there, right? So I'm going to try and break some of these examples down into a few categories that I hope make sense. Clearly everyone here understands that there is more than one way to do it in Perl. However, not every way is a good way to do it, and so we're going to see a few examples of things that might actually work, but oh Lord, I hope not. But hopefully if you see something and you go, hey, I used to do that, you say I used to do that, and not, hey, I do that. So we'll go from there. We'll start with the basics, because everyone starts with the basics, right? And that's the least funny stuff, so we'll build it up and we'll get more and more funny as time goes on. So who sees the problem here? This is the first mistake every student makes in Perl, right? This is the first mistake every single one of us makes in Perl, which is accidentally using trying to use a conditional and accidentally setting a value somewhere. And depending on whether you are using warnings and stricts, you end up with various types of warnings and or errors. So luckily, it doesn't take a whole lot of experience before you don't make that error. You move on to the next one, which everybody knows exactly what's going on here. Right? You'll notice I highlight these in yellow so you don't have to try and figure out where the error was. No, it's very clear where the error is. Show of hands, who's never done this? Show of hands, who won't raise their hand? Let's recalibrate everything here. So, yeah. Believe it or not, this one happens to me frequently. And before you go, what a moron, I should preface this by saying I spend about 6 months out of the year doing hardcore programming in Perl, and the other 6 months out of the year I have to program in PHP. So when I try and go backwards, it's like, oh, I'm a dork. So when students submit this code, yeah, I don't feel too bad for them.
I did that yesterday.
Yesterday? Nice, I did that yesterday was the comment, yeah.
I did that a lot because of C++.
Yeah, C++, a lot of people are saying the same idea.
I think Bourne Shell has those in the opposite.
Yep. Bourne Shell flips them, yeah. Well,
Bourne Shell does it backwards, so.
Yeah, Shell does it backwards, of course. So why do I bring up equal versus, equal versus the equal sign? Basically, I bring this up to introduce an idea that I want to promote a little bit, which is humility. A very wise man once said, humility is knowing your exact place in the universe and not attempting to act either above it or below it. And I think that's a really good thing to know. I make mistakes in my presentations to students, and when they point it out, I always go, oh, you're right, I totally screwed up. And they're always really shocked. They're like, oh, professor just admitted he screwed something up? Whoa. But they need to know that everyone's human, right? And junior programmers need to see senior level programmers explain to them how to fix a mistake that they've made. And that means that senior programmers have to actually admit that they've made a mistake in front of a junior programmer. Who doesn't like doing that? I'll raise my hand. I don't like doing that. But it's really important because we don't learn a lot from our successes. We learn a lot from our mistakes. How many people can remember something embarrassing they did in high school? Why do you still remember it? Because that's how we learn.
I choose to block it out.
I choose to block it out. Yeah. How many people did too many drugs in high school and don't remember? No, I don't want to know. I really don't. So, everybody makes the same basic mistakes, right? So, we start out making basic mistakes. But let's move on to control flow, because control flow is a place where you can see some mistakes that people make that are, somewhat less obvious to you why they would have done it. Here is a piece of code that was submitted to me as part of a final assignment. Who sees the problem here?
Braces balanced?
Yes, all of the braces balanced. The problem is they were using 8 literal spaces as their tab stop, and I was grading it on a small screen. As a result, it wrapped, which made it hard for me to wrap my head around what was really going on here. So, yeah, pardon me. Lesson I learned from in levels of nested if. Know when it's time to refactor your code? That's probably, who has never refactored anything they've ever written? Yeah, I wouldn't admit that either. At the risk of bringing up something somewhat controversial, the Perl Best Practices book, there's a recommended compromise, which is 4 literal spaces for your indenting rather than 8 or using actual tabs or things like that. I didn't like that advice when I first started coding. And then I started grading student code and decided I like that advice. It helps a lot. But don't expect that your replacement or your coworkers have the same size screen that they're editing your code on. It can sometimes be a useful thing. Now, I also got this particular piece of code. I'll give you a second. What's it doing?
Going through 1 through 4.
It's a standard if, else, else. They just keep indenting it. Yeah, I don't know why the next conditional gets indented. And when I asked the student, they were like, what? And they didn't really know what was going on either. And it's real code. I'm not making this up. But it led to this error, which was slightly interesting. Who sees the problem here? I'll give you the hint. The problem is here, or over there. It's over there. What's wrong with that last else statement? You never get to it, right. That particular example came out of one of the previous 2 examples, same code. I believe it was the one with the wonky indenting, which led to doing these kinds of things. Now, nobody's ever made this error, right?
Wait, is it E?
No,
it's else.
Yeah, too many E's.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, I typoed that one. That's me. So, for those of you who missed it and came in late, I screwed up. I made a mistake. That was all me. And it's okay if you make mistakes. So I wasn't lying. That's what I do. So, who's ever made that mistake? Probably. You may not recognize it like that, but you might recognize it like this. This was another one that got submitted that was slightly more subtle. Who sees what's going to happen? So if you ever try and do the fork operation there and you're returning something back and you're checking whether something comes back defined, the value that's going to come back from fork is going to be negative when you're unable to fork, right? But that becomes a problem when you're then later on checking to see if your process ID is greater than 0 or equal to 0 or else, because we've already died, right? Which ended up being the actual problem. And it wasn't until I assigned a follow-up assignment to the student, which was In the event you are unable to fork, let's do something else. We were testing proc limits on the server and working on a few other things. So, yeah, that's when things all of a sudden didn't quite work the way they were expecting. Now, who's done something like that? Right? It's a little bit easier to do that than it is to just do the if, greater, equal, whatever. So, I know some of you are going to be worried that students who produce code like this will never be able to produce a product which could then go on to be marketable. But I am here today to tell you there is a market for absolutely anything. And I mean absolutely anything.
Sexy sweaters.
Yes, you will notice this is from Sexy Sweaters. I don't make these things up.
You don't need.
You don't need to. You really don't. No. So that takes us to the next category of error, which I call, okay, that's just weird. Does anyone know how to read the words on this sign? I would love to know what it's saying. Don't park here or the natives will, I don't know. Why? Oh, this is don't park next to the soccer stadium. I mean football. No, sorry. So, yeah, sometimes there's no words to really describe the lengths that students will go to submit things. I got this particular piece of code. I will give you a second to absorb its wisdom. What are we doing? We are appending a new line to whatever string is passed into the function, the subroutine, because that's significantly easier than doing what? Just adding new line at the end of it. I asked the student about this particular one, and I said, why did you feel the need to abstract that? A long pause. Should I not have? And I said, well, what was the end goal that made you want to do the abstraction? Well, you said we should abstract things. You're right, I did. I said there's always, there's always the chance that your code might need to be abstracted. So that leads me to this question about over-abstraction versus...
Previous slide, were those supposed to be underscores in the variable name?
No, these are dashes.
They can't have dashes in Perl.
Perl 6 it works.
I don't know why it worked. Oh, maybe they were underscores. I don't remember. I was typing it all straight over rather than copying and pasting because I had issues copying out of whatever I was doing. So, yeah, maybe they were supposed to be underscores. In any case, that leads us to this question of under-abstraction versus over-abstraction. Why is over-abstraction bad? Java. Okay, because Java. Now, I'm genuinely curious why people think, under abstraction, right, because then you just sort of wander your ifs all over the place, you don't reuse code, but why over abstraction? Why is it bad?
There is a cost to a call.
There's a cost to a call? Okay, that makes sense. Why reinvent something that already exists kind of thing? Sometimes it makes it hard to read. Yeah, when you got to go through like 5 levels of modules to try and figure out where the actual code is taking place, yeah, that's sort of an idea. So, when you run across code like this, sometimes you think that the right solution, is clearly, well, what we should have done is rather than directly using the 0th index, obviously we should have just shifted. That was one of those spots you were supposed to laugh. Wow, okay. Wincing, okay, wincing's good, wincing's good, no. Because that was, well, I won't say it. So, that leads us to another issue. When you're not quite sure how to accomplish a certain task, and you finally figure it out, and you get this nice little block of code that solves your problem, and you wonder, how do I tell the guy who has to edit this code later why I did it that way? What do you use to do this? Comments. Documentation. Yes, documentation. Who thinks documentation's a bad thing? Some of you do. I understand this. I understand that some people do. How many of you are just trolls? That was more, okay. So, documentation. Not everything needs to be documented, right? There's a time and a place for documentation. Sometimes it's not needed all the time. But I'm not going to tell you how to write good documentation, and I'm not going to tell you how to write bad documentation. I'm going to show you some documentation that I received. For example, this one. That's too bad Randall's not here. Who knows what this is doing? It's setting auto flush on all the handles, right. So, as part of one of the classes I taught, we were using the Perl cookbook. And of course, the Perl cookbook being somewhat long in the tooth now, this exists in one of the, it's either the Select or the iNet. What was it? I think it's one of the socket examples that uses this one.
Socket.io, maybe.
Yeah, Socket.io, I think, is where it was. And I told the students, you don't have to worry about this because we have what now? Auto flush enabled by default on newer versions, right? So the students were just copying and pasting the code and putting it in there. And I told them, if you have a piece of code that you think might confuse me, you have to document it. So he documented it. So I got a hold of Randall on IRC and said, or on Twitter, and I said, now I'm trying to figure out how to explain this one to a student. And chatted for a little bit and decided that I was going to update my documentation in my slides to include this documentation as the appropriate way to document. No, not really, but I kind of felt like it. So then I ran across this one. How many of you have ever written that documentation? How many of you have wanted to write that documentation? Yeah. See, sometimes documentation is not necessarily about telling the guy who edits my code later what it was I was thinking so much as it is telling him what it was I was feeling at the time that I wrote this. You know, rage, anger, frustration, you know. Yeah. So, in order to explain why it's so great to have I/O socket, we were dealing with raw sockets for a little bit because I'm cruel. And I ran into this particular piece of documentation. To which I responded, "You don't say." Remember, yes, yeah. Remember, not all documentation is needed. Okay. Not everything is a good idea. For example, bacon fries. Because why fries? You have bacon. What? Okay, fries, good. Had fries for lunch. Bacon, good. Had bacon for breakfast.
That's for dinner.
No. Why? I don't know. Documentation. Now, was that really needed? I don't know. This was all the documentation that kept coming back. But then occasionally, rather than getting documentation you don't need, you don't get documentation when you actually wish you had had it. Like this one, for example. Now, I had to read this 4 or 5 times to figure out what was going on. Clearly, this is a hash table. You know how I know that? Because variable names. Yeah. It turns out this was for a project which involved playing tic-tac-toe with the user, and they were storing the board positions as a row, comma, column, 2-dimensional array. So they needed to know, if you pick a number between 1 and 9, what's the row and column associated with it? And that's what this hash table was looking at. It's obvious, right? Because we could put 3 rows and 3 columns. Right? Well, you put in 2. Just add another one. Make it a little easier to read. And document it. Why are you just... We had a discussion, and it was very polite and tactful, and my hand did not hurt at the end of the discussion in the slightest. But that leads me to a little tiny bit of a digression here, if I may. If any of you are students, please be aware that the amount of interest that your instructor will have in your code is inversely proportional to how long it takes the instructor to read your code and figure out what the heck you were doing or trying to do. I can't stop myself. That's just... I guess I'll digress on one other point. Now, who thinks it's just better to have self-documenting code? Some of my professors think there's some of the guys that I work with, they think it's better to just let students make self-documenting code. But when I asked my students for self-documenting code, I discovered something about students and self-documenting code. Anybody want to guess what it is?
They're mutually exclusive?
They're mutually exclusive. That's a tactful way to put what I was going to say, which is they suck at it. And I know there are organizations who want you to do self-documenting code, but there are also organizations that want you to write code and document every single thing that you write. You know, there's some places that Friday is documentation day. You will document everything you write. Now, regardless of whether you think one is right or one is wrong, I sort of feel as an instructor that my job is to prepare students for whatever role they're going to go into when they hit industry. So they should have seen, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Makes sense, okay, we're going to go with that. So no, I don't ask them for self-documenting code, because no. Anyway, it ends up generally looking ironic. And this is why I warned those of you in the back. You better have really good eyesight or else you're just going to miss the jokes, and that's okay. So what do we learn from our exploration of the finer points of documentation? I personally think it's totally okay to liven up your code with interesting, humorous comments in your documentation, because if somebody is reading through 30, 40, 50 pages of your code and it's really dry, they're just going to kind of fall asleep and not have any real clue what's going on. But if you can keep them a little bit awake, just once every 10 pages with a little joke or something, I think that's okay. Maybe it's just because I'm in education and, no, you're not supposed to have humor, not in industry. I don't know, but I think it's fun, so. Now, the question of documentation is really a question about communicating clearly, right? There it goes. And I learned about communicating clearly from my father, who taught English for 35 years in the junior high, high school age range. And anytime I tried to explain something to him and he didn't get it, he had one phrase that he would come back with, which was his favorite dangling preposition, which goes, having many dangerous curves, she drove carefully down the mountain road. What's the subject being modified in that sentence? And it's sort of applicable when you start talking about code, right? I mean, if you read through the Camel book and you start seeing, oh yeah, it really makes a difference where your code stops parsing. Throw your cat downstairs a toy mouse to play with. It makes a big difference where you stop parsing this sentence. Don't throw your cat downstairs. That's a bad idea. That's how you ruin the carpet. I have 2 cats and they're rescues, okay? I can make the joke. I don't throw them down the stairs. I throw their toys down the stairs. And I throw them away when they get them in the water. So, I once got a question from a student that really caught me off guard, which is why I really started thinking about communicating clearly. And we were trying to figure out, how do we write a real-to-life shuffle algorithm using an array, right? Using an array. Everybody does this. This is the obvious exercise you do in class. And the question I got was, what's a deck of cards? What? What's a deck of cards? No, she's not a native English speaker. She grew up somewhere in Southeast Asia, and I don't know where it was, but she had never seen a deck of cards. And so I took one out, because I keep one in my bag all the time, because that's just how I roll. And I was like showing how you, shuffle cards and how you deal cards. I said, oh, okay. I'm like, you've never seen this before? No, I've heard of think about it, but I don't know. So I started including, links to Wikipedia about what is a deck of cards, what is poker, what is a hand of cards, these kinds of things. And I learned, it's important to be very specific in how we communicate, to communicate clearly and not to make assumptions. Yes. Yes, this is the long-clawed slow cat. But communication is not just about user specifications and things like that, right? It's also important to somebody's finally able to read the text from the back. Or just recognize it's a sloth, one or the other. Now, we had a bit of an assignment here, which was using LWP to go and check the status of the document on Google. And so I would run the code, and I would wait for, a couple of, maybe a half a second for the return thing to come back. And I would wait until I got my command prompt back, and then I'd start working on some other stuff. When I ran this particular one, I kept waiting for the command prompt to come back. And it took me a while to realize that the command prompt had, in fact, come back, right? It's right there. But they didn't end with a new line, so I was just sitting there going, how come you're just taking forever? No, it just ran instantly. This was good code, not bad code, except for be aware of how the end user is going to be using your code and try and come up with a way that clearly communicates what has happened to the end user when it's appropriate.
They needed to abstract the print.
Yeah, they need to abstract. See, this should have used print with new line. Or in new versions of Perl, we call it say. Yes, thank you. So you tell I'm an instructor, I wait for you to answer the questions when possible. Sorry, it's an annoying habit. Now, I very clearly communicate the manner in which I want files named before they are uploaded to the system for me to grade. And I'm very particular about this. It will be the first letter of your first name, followed by your last name, followed by an underscore character, followed by either HW or LAB, depending on whether this is a homework or a lab, followed by 2 digits which represent the assignment number. And I am very particular about this for a reason. And the reason is, one time I wasn't.
One time.
Believe it or not, every single one of these make sense. The naming conventions all make sense. 117, why does that make sense? It was January 17th, which was the 3rd week of class, which is why the 3s. It was homework assignment number 4, which is why all the 4s. Now, there are about 33% of assignments missing here. Anybody want to guess the reason? Collision, yes. However, what do I call him? Jason Smith was good enough to name his homework assignment appropriately. J. Smith 3, week 3. Yeah. So, I tried to figure out how do I communicate to students that this may not be the most efficient way to turn in assignments. And I decided that I would simply give them back their grades. So I did. I walked up to the whiteboard and I wrote several 7s and 6s and 10s and 9s and here you go, here's your grades. And they said, whose is whose? And I said, how would I know? The next week, the assignments that were returned were immaculately well named. And this brings us to the discussion about not making your colleagues evil, right? I needed a slide that would give me an opportunity to take a drink of water because I knew I was going to be hoarse at that point, and I have never looked at this and not smiled. So, learning to communicate clearly. What should we learn from our interesting endeavors here? Number 1, don't make assumptions about what your user knows about your code. Number 2, don't make assumptions about what your coworkers know about your code. And number 3, don't make assumptions about what you know about your code, because 3 months from now you won't remember them anyway. Now, those of you who have ever used Unix know that when you run a utility in Unix and you don't provide it the input that it expects, it will tell you usage, right. That's the default way to fail in Unix, is what were you actually expecting to see. It will give you back your usage. Now, usage information can either be rendered effectively, efficiently, or it can be rendered like this. Now, this particular piece of code, we would pass the code a server name and it would check whether the server was up. However, this individual submitted 10 late assignments, and I was going through grading all 10 assignments late, didn't know which particular one I was looking at. And when I ran across this error message, I went, that doesn't help me know what your script is supposed to be doing. Yes, it's an actual assignment, and yeah. Be cognizant of the other side of your script. Right? You're on the writing end. Be cognizant of those poor people who are on the running end. I mean the good, healthy user. Poor souls. And that leads us to a question about efficiency. Now, what I like to say about efficiency is, the first idea that pops into your head about how to solve a problem, generally speaking, is not the right one if the problem is sufficiently difficult to solve. You know, some of these, you just have to see the code. Here's one. You know, that's a lot of weird code, so I'm going to tell you what's going on here. This is back to the question about the tic-tac-toe board, and we were trying to pick a random move. And so the way they decided to do that was to pick a number between 1 and 9, which are the positions on the board, and check an array to see if there was, you know, something in use there. And if there was, it would just pick another number. Yeah. How many times are you going to run through this when there's only one choice left on the board that's valid? Possibly infinite. It's kind of unlikely. But what happens when your data set is not a tic-tac-toe board of 9 entries, but, you know, a catalog of 2 billion items? You will eventually get an answer. It's a race condition. Will that happen, or will we reach the cold death of the sun first? I don't know. But yeah. What's the obvious answer for solving this problem, this specific one? A hash of used values that you can easily query. That's one way to do it. The way I told them to solve it was just make an array of possible values and pick a random number and splice that entry off. Which, you know, eventually you only got one left. So we thought that was maybe a good way to do it.
And it gets more efficient as it goes.
And it gets more efficient? Yeah, it's faster the farther you go along. So the more people who use it, the faster it doesn't end up not becoming. That works. How weird that works. Now, this was a fun one. Here we were supposed to be looking at what happens when child processes exit. So we were going to fork off a child process, and then we were going to, in another window, have top open and sort of see how things were happening, and then the child process would eventually exit, and when it would exit, you know, it would use $, it would show you the PIDs, and we could track that stuff. Who sees what's wrong with this?
It'll fork and then die.
Yes. It will continue to fork. Now, it was supposed to wait 5 seconds. The student was getting tired of waiting about what was going on. So they moved it to 1 second. What happens every second? The number of processes in RAM? Double. Because we don't actually ever get to that problem. See, we were supposed to be looking whether the process ID is greater than or equal to 0, and we didn't. But there was another really interesting case, which was when they were still trying to figure things out, and they thought, well, maybe if we got rid of the sleep condition, it would be easier to figure out what was going on. This particular one, okay. That particular one, not so much. When I got this particular example that came in, I was not really understanding that. Who actually thought this one was the wrong one? Yeah, no, this is the one you don't actually want to be doing. That was why you guys were confused. Sorry, I was ahead of myself. I screwed up, and it's okay. So, there you go. What time is it? Oh, what time are we supposed to be out of here? 15. You guys are going to be so happy because you're going to be able to get to the coffee a lot easier because I talk fast when I am in front of people. That's okay. So, conclusions. I write myself notes because that's the way it is. When possible, be humble about your code. When possible, communicate very clearly. And, you know, Perl's pretty powerful. And, you know, it's good to be careful with your power when that comes, right? So, all of my slides are basically from Fail Blog, all of the funny pictures. So. Fail Blog needed attribution, so there you go. Yeah, that's all I got. So. I hope it was funny for the last day.
Can I make a comment?
Sorry?
I just want to make a comment.
Sure.
The student who did abstract that print line basically designed say, which we needed a long time before we got it.
Say?
Isn't it say that?
Yeah, say. I wasn't...
So, you know, I'm just saying that, like, even in their, what's like stupidity or whatever, sometimes you can sort of like rescue the situation a little bit by letting them know, you know what, you were on to something.
You know, a lot of really amazing things have happened when somebody screwed something up and then said, this is a problem. How can we turn it into something good? And yeah, no, it turns out to be an okay thing to do. The problem I had was that I never could get a good answer from the student as to why they did it, which always makes me nervous. But you guys are welcome to ask questions or call me a moron. That's fine. Yeah.
The slide with the street sign on it, Google Translate says it's cargo handling in Icelandic, which helps clarify the picture not a damn bit at all.
So the weird sign was cargo handling. Okay. In what, Norwegian?
Icelandic.
Icelandic, okay. Well, I wasn't even close. Okay.
So those are like Icelandic natives or something?
So the one of the first slides you had the crazy indentation. And did I hear you correctly say you were upset about the tabs? Like the hard tabs? Because, and I know it's always word, I'm going to get into it. Because I used to be a pure space guy for years and years and years and years and years. And the best argument I've ever heard is that somebody goes, I like 8 spaces, and then they hard code 8 spaces for everything, you can't get out of that wrapping.
No. What I was upset about wasn't that they were using hard tabs. It was that they were using actual spaces.
Okay.
8 literal spaces, and I was grading it on a small screen.
Okay, so it wasn't.
So it just kept wrapping. That was really...
Carry on.
No, I'm done. You guys are welcome to talk about whatever you want. Or just leave, that's cool.
In this picture you found now, isn't that a prop?
Isn't that a prop?
No, it's the most dangerous.
It's an actual weapon. What's wrong with you? Wait, what are you saying?
The war's happened!
Yeah, like I said, if you came here looking for amazingly accurate advice on making your code great, that's the wrong place to go. No, I just laugh at stuff. Yeah.
Well, so if you work as you're a sysadmin at the university.
Yeah.
So do you end up getting student workers who are helping you out?
No.
Okay.
No, what I was saying is I worked full-time as a system administrator, but the guy that taught the Perl class left. He retired, and they needed somebody who could do it, so I agreed to cut my hours so that I could teach a class.
So, because the dilemma that I find is that I do get student workers, and I just don't, and they code like that, and I don't know how you want to be good and helpful in education and be a good mentor, and you kind of just want to say, go away.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting problem, and one that we really run into. Now, Deanne's is a community college, so you would think, okay, that means 2-year institution, so you're going to have your students for 2 years. In actual fact, it means you have about 3/4 for the average student that you're going to interact with them. That's the amount of time they spend. Because we're in the middle of Silicon Valley, and a lot of times we have students that are full-time in a career, and they just want to hit the institution for a quarter or two, to, retool a little bit, and then boom, they're back out. And that's really what they're looking for. In between, a lot of students who come from that aspect, we also have students that come from the other side, which are, the career students. They're coming up, they just came out of high school. They need to get through community college, get the AA so they can transfer on to a 4-year institution or something. And one of those groups would be really good at helping you as a student programmer, and they're not interested because they have a full-time career. The other ones, well, yeah, you get a lot of this code, and I don't use student workers for my system administration job. Now, some of my coworkers do for some of the other stuff. Video production stuff, yes, we teach video production classes, so we also run a TV studio out of my same division. They do a lot of student workers, production and encoding and things like that. But yeah, as a sysadmin, it's really hard to find a way to do that. Plus, a lot of the systems I have, I can't give them access to. Right? That's a FERPA violation, so...
And thank goodness.
Yeah.
I'm going to go volunteer.
Oh, sorry, no, it's FERPA violation. Sorry, can't let you. really wish you could help me out.
I graduated with a master's.
Yeah. Other questions, comments? Yeah.
It makes me think of in the Perl book it says, code as if the next person who's going to read it is a violent psychopath that knows where you live.
Yeah, that's how I open my lecture for my first day of Advanced Perl, which is code as if the individual who's going to be reading your code is a homicidal psychopath who knows where you live. Because I do!
And that might be you from 3 months from now, right?
Yeah, well, you know. Yeah, it may very well be you in 3 months. Yes, very good. Especially if the code you're writing drives you insane, yes. Anyway, feel free to go early. Okay. Thanks for coming. I appreciate it.